Everyone, welcome to Old News, where the fossils are old but discoveries are new. My name is Laura Beth. I am your host today, so I'm going to keep an eye on our live chat where you can ask questions or make comments. We would love to hear from you today. And if you are new to Old News, I do want to remind you that you can play Old News Bingo with us. If you're a registrant, then you received the printout sheets, and if you are just joining us, you can find the link in the chat. So we hope that some of you can play, and if you happen to win bingo, please let us know in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our expert, Dr. Christian Kammerer, the museum's research curator of paleontology. Hey, Christian.
Hey, Laura Beth, great to be here.
I'm so excited. I hear that December has brought us a new dinosaur.
That's right. So most months bring us new dinosaurs these days. We are in the midst of kind of a golden age for modern dinosaur discoveries. More than 40 new dinosaurs have been discovered every year for the past few years. So the pace of new research has been increasing by a huge amount. But a lot of these are known from very fragmentary specimens, some of them only from a single bone. So it can be a little difficult to try to, put a face to the name for some of these animals, which is why I'm very excited to say that today we have a new dinosaur that's known from quite a lot of material. In fact, nearly complete skeleton. And usually, with these old news presentations, I like to start out giving a little bit of sort of like the context and background for what we're talking about. But today we're just going to get right into it. Let's get right to the new dinosaur. So this is a scientific artist's reconstruction of it. It's an animal called Stegosaurus. So this is a new taxon of armored dinosaur. And it's quite an interesting creature. So, among the notable aspects of it, one is its completeness. So, maybe in this sort of 75% range complete skeleton there, including, importantly, large sections of the skull, even some of the teeth, very well preserved, basically the entire tail. And it has a really unusually short tail for a dinosaur, with some very interesting features to the armor, as we'll be talking about in quite a bit. And then, most of the limbs and substantial portions of the girdle. So really, able to say a lot about what this animal looked like as a sort of a complete animal. And so it was found in South America, in Chile. It was actually found in sub-Antarctic Chile, all the way down in one of the southernmost parts of the continent, in Ultima Esperanza province. This is a pretty, understudied area paleontologically for sure. It's also a very difficult area to work in because it's mostly sort of high mountains and sort of glacier fields. Very, difficult field work is my understanding, being able to pull Stegosaurus out of there. So these are rocks from the late Cretaceous. This is in the Campanian, which is not quite at the very end of the Cretaceous, but pretty close to there. So a little bit earlier than things like in the Northern Hemisphere, Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops, but part of that sequence. A lot of the earlier, Cretaceous rocks in the Rocky Mountains and in Canada are in the Campanian, where you get like these huge numbers of duck-billed dinosaurs and horned dinosaurs, and some of the other armored dinosaurs really are diversifying in the Campanian. So another thing that's interesting about this creature is it's a quite a small dinosaur. So based on the skeletal elements and how sort of heavily fused they are, the authors, some of whom are shown here, to scale with the animal, suggests that it's an adult. So that cardboard cutout there is life size. This is a creature that would have only been around 6 feet long, 2 meters as an adult, which is, quite dinky for a dinosaur. We think of dinosaurs as being gigantic mostly. And, there are some small ones out there, little theropods like Compsognathus, or a lot of the bird-like dinosaurs are small. But most of the plant-eating dinosaurs that you think of are tend towards the larger size. Even the other ankylosaurs, the other armored dinosaurs, they tend, they're not the biggest animals in the world. So a lot of them were kind of in the 15-foot, 20-foot range. The biggest one, Ankylosaurus itself, probably did not exceed 30 feet, if that. But 6 feet as an adult really is unusually tiny. There's one other very small ankylosaurian, this animal Liaoningosaurus from China, which is also very weird. But most of them substantially bigger than this. So as I've mentioned, it's an armored dinosaur. So the technical term for that group is the Thyreophora, and it contains these two major subgroups and then a few other smaller groups, the Stegosaurs and the Ankylosaurs. So they're differentiated by a number of features, but mostly it's very obvious in terms of their armor, what kind of thyreophoran you're dealing with. So stegosaurs have this row of plates and sometimes spikes along the back, and then this series of spikes on the tip of the tail. And then ankylosaurs also have armor plates, have osteoderms, but they're sort of like an armor shell or a carapace along the back. And then some of the advanced ankylosaurs have a club rather than spikes at the end of the tail. So both of these groups, have these tail weapons, and it's thought that, these were defensive in nature. They were used to protect them against predators. There's even evidence of, some of paleopathologies in some big theropod dinosaurs of having been the victims of defense from these things. And so they each, are different in morphology and have different functional implications and have been given different names. So the one in Ankylosaurus is generally just called a club, tail club. The spike array in Stegosaurs has been increasingly called in the technical literature a thagomizer, which is in reference to a Far Side cartoon from back from the 1980s, much beloved by scientists generally. I know there are some stegosaur specialists who do not like this and very much wish people would stop calling them thagomizers. But really seems like the horse is out of the barn on that one. Use of thagomizer is only increasing, and I think it's going to be very difficult to displace. And it does sort of need a name. We use words to describe anatomy. And tail spine array is a bit clunky compared to thagomizer. So with this in mind, the authors, the Chilean group of paleontologists who discovered Stegosaurus, they also thought there should be a name for its unique tail weapon. So it's not really a tail club. It's not that solid, massive bone that you see in Ankylosaurus. They aren't discrete spikes like in Stegosaurs. It's kind of this flattened, almost frond-like set of osteoderms forming, it's a club-like or almost axe-like structure. And with that in mind, they argued, or proposed rather, it should be called Mazahuit, which is an Aztec war club. So it was a weapon used actually by a number of Mesoamerican peoples. But best known in the Aztec Empire. This is a wooden club with a series of usually obsidian blades stuck into the side, which, of weapons that exist, it is pretty close to what we see in Stegosaurus here. So adding a new bit of verbiage to the dinosaurian lexicon there. So this is a new group that they recognize for. It is an ankylosaur, but because of its very strange tail anatomy and some other aspects of its anatomy, they put it in a new subgroup of ankylosaurs called Parankylosaurus. And interestingly, this seems to include some other ankylosaurs from the southern hemisphere, from the far southern hemisphere, in fact. The closest relative of Stegosaurus seems to be this animal Antarctopelta, which, as the name indicates, was found in Antarctica. It was actually the first dinosaur found in Antarctica. Known from very, very fragmentary materials, but what is there does seem to be very similar to Stegosaurus. And also this animal Kombarosaurus from Australia, which is known from better material, including a lot of the skeleton and the skull. which may be similar to another Australian dinosaur, Minmi, that requires sort of reinvestigation. But what's known of the Kombarosaurus skull is quite similar in a lot of ways to Stegoros. So it seems like we have this new group of Parankylosaurian dinosaurs that was restricted to the southern hemisphere. And this is actually very interesting, from a biogeographic standpoint in terms of how animals are distributed across the earth. Because when you think about, basically where are the best known dinosaurs found? Like when you think, okay, the really big name dinosaurs, things like Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops, or even things like Iguanodon and Archaeopteryx, they're not found in the southern hemisphere here. They're mostly northern hemisphere dinosaurs. And this is the result of what we call megabias in collection and study. It's not that more dinosaurs lived in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere, just that through a number of sort of like socioeconomic and cultural and geographic, historical aspects of the history of science, there's been more focus on animals in the northern hemisphere, fossil collection in the northern hemisphere, than in the southern hemisphere, sort of through modern human history. And so some paleontologists have called this the Sherwin-Williams effect, in reference to the old Sherwin-Williams ads that show, paint covering the earth from top to bottom. I will note, looking at it now, that it seems that's actually a bit inaccurate, because in the ad, they're covering the earth is tilted such that they're covering the western hemisphere with paint, and then it's dripping to the eastern hemisphere. So it's not quite showing like what we're talking about, which is that northern hemisphere is more studied, and then the further south you go, the less coverage you get. But until we have a better name for that, we'll keep calling it the Sherwin-Williams effect. But as new things are being found in the southern hemisphere, they're showing that actually they can be quite different from really anything we know from northern faunas. So in addition to these Parankylosaurs, in Chile, in actually the area north of where Stegoros was found, they found a few years ago a Jurassic dinosaur called Chilesaurus, which, as one of the first dinosaurs found from the country, gets the name, even though, maybe a little bit boring, but, they'll get other names as new things are discovered. But Chilesaurus is a very, very weird dinosaur. So it is unclear what it even is. So, there are three major groups of dinosaurs: the ornithischians, which are plant-eating dinosaurs, things like duckbills, horned dinosaurs, armored dinosaurs. The sauropodomorphs, which are also mostly plant eaters. Those are the long-necked dinosaurs, things like Diplodocus. And then there are the theropods, which are mostly the meat-eating dinosaurs, things like TRex, Velociraptor, Allosaurus, that whole group. And Chilesaurus kind of shows features of all three of those clades. And it's still, a point of debate among paleontologists which one it really belongs to, or whether it actually represents sort of a transitional form, very early diverging form, sort of intermediate between some of these groups. Like, for example, it's been argued by some scientists that it's evidence that theropods actually evolved into ornithischians, or at least some of them did. But basically, what I'm trying to say with all this is that it's clear that a lot of the fossil history, the evolutionary history of dinosaurs is happening in the southern hemisphere, is happening in localities that we haven't looked at, that paleontologists have not sampled widely. And it's really, very important that we both expand sort of our geographic focus and foster local paleontology, works of people on the ground in places like Chile, at Chilean institutions out there finding new fossils. Because who knows what else, with as amazing discoveries as Chilesaurus and Stegoros are, and these are both bizarre but wonderfully complete and informative animals. And there must be plenty out there left to find if you've got people just out there looking.
That's awesome, Christian. So before we get into the questions about the specific species, I just want to know, is there anything that we can do from here in Raleigh to help out with paleontology efforts around the world, like to show support that they should be happening? Um,
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I for the lay public, not a huge amount. I mean, these are things that there need to be funding at governmental levels and within the scientific community, education and mentoring of people in international collaborations, and getting students from other countries. So if you're not someone who's accepting grad students right now, or writing grants for postdocs in other countries, you probably can't do that much.
mhm.
With that said, it's there's there are public science programs all over. I don't know of any in in Chile, for instance, where sort of just like people online can go in and help out. But certainly there are such things exist. And
Citizen science projects.
citizen science projects, yeah, it's more difficult with paleontology than other things, because it's not like you can just and this is not to diminish the amount of work that goes into like bird tagging or noting when monarch butterflies show up every year. I mean, that's the work that's being done is great, but the requirements of going out and digging up fossils, preparing and identifying them, is a level beyond what a lot of people just are prepared for. With that said, there are plenty of fossils to be found most anywhere you live, with few exceptions, unless you're living on like volcanic islands. There are probably fossils somewhere within at least a couple hours drive. And any fossil discoveries, alert your local museums, talk to paleontologists, can help out with that. But yeah, in terms of building the infrastructure internationally for entirely new science programs, yeah, most of our
Mhm.
viewers probably will not be able to.
Yeah. Well, no, that's still really helpful. And I think that even knowing that there's paleontology efforts all around the world
Mhm.
and dinosaurs all around the world, I think that's like one small step, in that direction, right? Is that we all just are more aware and share what
Yeah,
we learn. Yeah. Well, awesome. So we do have a little discussion in the chat on whether or not the new dinosaur Stegoros is cute or not. I
it is
think
cute.
it's
I'm
very
coming
cute.
down. I'm coming down on that. It is a very cute dinosaur. It has a cute
um,
face. It's little. What more do you want?
I know, right? It's about 6 feet long, so no bigger than a Komodo dragon, right?
Yeah.
And they're cute in their own right. But Matthew did say Ariops is cute. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Uh,
Um,
Eriops is that's a Permian temnospondyl amphibian. And yes, I would say without qualifications, cute animal.
I'll have to look that one up. Um, all right. Well, and Anne made a good observation that leads me to my question. Their tail looks a lot like a beaver tail. Are we sure they weren't just using their wide, flat
Mhm.
tail to kind of like smack? What do they do? They smack the water with their beaver tail, and
Yeah.
then
So
maybe they built dams.
so let's pull Stegoros up again here. Um, and yes, it does have this very widened, flattened tail, but if you were using that for propulsion during swimming, as beavers do, you probably would not want it made out of bone. So the edges to the tail it is solid bone. These are osteoderms. You can see, yeah, on the bottom right, actually seeing the fossil there. So this is, like if you were using this in the water, this is like giving yourself cement shoes. You don't want massive, solid bone. You're going to sink to the bottom. So probably not for that purpose. It's also the tail is very short. Like it is, there are some very beaver-like fossil mammals, including, some from the Mesozoic, completely unrelated, that are would have had beaver-like tails, but those are just expansions of the skin and sort of scaly surface integument there. So not using bony projections there, especially not these really massive sort of solid bone ones. So I think that that's just, superficial, that it wouldn't have had a beaver-like purpose. It probably did have a defensive purpose like these other thyreophorans.
Yeah, and so do you know, are those fossils of the tail, the osteoderms on the side, are they sharp like an axe? Do we know if they were sharp versus heavy or
So
both?
they probably, you wouldn't cut your finger on the edge of it. It's not that sharp, but it does have an edge to it, and it does have a pointed tip. And it's just like a lot of force behind it. Like, you can cut, if you just have a stick from a tree that has a few like sharp edges to it, even if it's blunt-ish, you can draw blood on
That
someone. I
would
mean,
hurt.
not
Yeah,
that I have or ever would. But just imagine, even on a small animal, that the force of the pelvic musculature, sort of in the hips, propagating through that tail, actually being shorter, in some ways would concentrate that force to it. So there's actually been a lot of work done on the functional mechanics of tail weapons in thyreophorans. So for example, actually one paper that came out of our paleo lab here, when scientist Victoria Arbour, who's a Ankylosaurus specialist, when she was working in Lindsay Zano's lab here, looking at basically the evolution of the Ankylosaur tail club. And in that case, a lot of it was about stiffening the long portion of the tail and reinforcing it to create a more mace-like or baseball bat-like basically propagation of force. So you're starting with the force of movement of the muscles in the tail, and then you're trying to concentrate that on the weapon part in the tip. So in those advanced ankylosaurids, so not these earlier forms or earlier diverging forms like Stegoros, you have basically this long rod and then the club at the tip. And so there's not much force in the rod, and it's getting, concentrated at the tip. And then part also is like pulling inertia through that. So you're doing something different with the Stegoros tail, but it also would have had a lot of force behind it. And because it has that, pointier, sharper edge, it's less of, trying to shatter something and maybe more like cutting into a potential predator. Maybe, not quite slicing like a knife, but cutting open the legs of whatever theropod is trying to mess with it. So I think it still would have been, not something to be trifled with, even at small size.
You know what now this description is reminding me of? For all my Harry Potter fans out there, this is reminding me of blast-ended scroots a little bit. Maybe you haven't
I cannot say I know what those are.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm just imagining it now moving kind of like those, and I think it had more of a tail like a scorpion, but very very dangerous kind of animal. Not that Stegosaurus was dangerous, but
as long as you didn't cross it.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't start nothing, won't be nothing.
Oh my gosh, I love that. So speaking of don't start nothing, won't be nothing. If a T-Rex tried to start something, first off, would it ever come across a T-Rex? Second off, how would it fare? Do you think the T-Rex would win? I mean, it's like much larger.
Yeah, so two questions there. So one, they would not have met. T-Rex, as far as we know, only lived in North America in the Maastrichtian, which is the very end of the Cretaceous. So, I was talking before about how, the Southern Hemisphere dinosaurs for a long time were not super well known. As they have become known, as more and more discoveries have been made, it's clear that the top predators in the Southern Hemisphere, even at the same time that T-Rex lived, were not tyrannosaurs. They were completely different groups of dinosaurs. There's one called the Abelosaurs in particular that includes really famous taxa like the horned predator Carnotaurus, and related forms also from places like India and Madagascar. like Rajasaurus and Majungatholus, these sorts of animals, that these were the top predators in a lot of the South American communities. There's another group called the Dinosaurs that were, they do get into the late Cretaceous, but seem to have been most abundant earlier on. But include some of the largest theropods of all time, so things like Giganotosaurus and Tyranotitan. So if any of those, came across Stegoros, they probably could, do some damage to it. If, let's say, through time travel or whatever, T-Rex and Stegoros met, I think T-Rex could probably just step on it. Like, the size differential is pretty massive. I mean, 6-foot animal, you could probably just like kick it over or something. It's really, yeah, it's quite a wee little guy.
Oh.
So I think, Stegoros' weaponry would have been very effective against even things, a bit larger than it, animals in the, some of the theropods that were around there. There were big dromaeosaurs actually in South America at this time, things like this group called the Unenlagines, some of which, would have been quite formidable predators, but those are things getting up into kind of the 20-foot range. But once you're at T-Rex size, yeah, it's something that small. I mean, I think Stegoros, the best thing it would have going for it is that it would be kind of like below notice of an animal, Tyrannosaurus size. Like, they wouldn't even get that much meat out of it. It's mostly kind of like bony plate.
Yeah, like would they? I mean, I imagine that the armor would protect them at least a little bit, right? Like even turtles don't have very many natural predators when they're adults, and like everything, their shell is fully formed. Like if they come
Well,
across an alligator,
alligator can crack a turtle
can
shell.
definitely crack it. Yeah,
Yeah.
but like I don't know, I can't imagine there were that many creatures like that.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a very different ecosystem than it is today. We don't have, 40-foot long predators on land anymore. And yeah, the mean body size of basically most of the terrestrial animals was much higher. So, and everything kind of scales with that. So yeah, it's difficult to say one-to-one. But yeah, I mean, there are turtles have few predators, but alligators in just around here, alligators will take them. Cougars historically used to. Jaguars are known to predate quite a lot on turtles in South America now. So
Mhm.
I'm sure, yeah, Stegoros was probably protected from most things, but I'm sure it had its predators.
Mhm. And so speaking of the environment that it lived in, what
Mhm.
was its environment like? And then do we know, we've talked a lot about the tail weapon that it had, but do we know what other kinds of adaptations it had, like, and or even what it ate or noises it
Well,
made?
I mean, most Ankylosaurs, they have these fairly simple leaf-shaped teeth, which indicates that they're not processing one, they're eating plants, but two, they're not processing particularly difficult to eat plants. So in, a lot of the other ornithischian dinosaurs have these ridiculously complex tooth batteries, which are most extreme in the duck-billed dinosaurs. But you also see them in the horned dinosaurs, where it's just these, hundreds, sometimes thousands of teeth in the jaws, forming these kind of, crushing arrays for dealing with, what must have been pretty resistant foodstuffs. And you don't see those in stegosaurs and ankylosaurs. So it'd be browsing is likely, eating, fruits and such. There's been some arguments that a few ankylosaurs may have been omnivorous, so that fish have been found in association with that animal Launingosaurus that I mentioned earlier, the other small ankylosaur. Although it's all very controversial whether it was actually eating them or whether they were just preserved together. But yeah, ankylosaurs, they seem like they were not eating particularly tough stuff. As to the environments that they're living in, so Stegoros seems like it was found in, a lot of dinosaurs are found in kind of like floodplain deltaic environments, wet environments. So that doesn't mean that's where they were living all the time. That just means that's where they were preserved. So we know wet environments that have active sedimentation, things by rivers, things where lakes are being filled in. Places like deltas are more likely to preserve the fossils just because, rather than being out and getting scavenged and pulled apart and eroded down by wind and sun, if they're covered in mud, that's, step one to the fossilization process. So, just because we have a lot of fossils from floodplains doesn't mean that most dinosaurs were found in floodplains. But Stegosaurus probably was, in and around, large bodies of water, but that isn't necessarily only where it was. For Ankylosaurs, though, there are some interesting sort of taphonomic features to the history of the group. So things to do with how they were preserved and where they were living. They are fairly rare in North America and in South America, but in individual ecosystems, but they seem to have been more abundant in Asia. There's like big really big deposits in like the Gobi Desert where you find a lot of ankylosaur fossils. So they may have been more abundant maybe in some drier areas even. On the other side of things, ankylosaurs are also some of the dinosaurs that are found most often in marine ecosystems. And it's been argued that this is just because they're better at the bloat and float, because their bodies are held together by armor plate. When one dies and becomes filled with the gases of decay, if it falls in a river, a lot of dinosaurs, just burst open and then fall to the ground and be covered in mud. But if you have basically this armored balloon of corpse gas, it can go all the way out into the deep ocean before it, bursts and goes down to the seafloor. So, you've got ankylosaur skeletons of multiple taxa that have been found in marine deposits because of that. So they probably, like a lot of groups today, we're in a diversity of ecosystems. In the ones in the Gobi, it was dry back then. They may have been living in arid environments, even in deserts. But then some of these in North America may have been living in very wet, maybe even swampy or riverine ecosystems, such that they occasionally got washed out to sea. So, it's a species-rich group that was probably doing a lot of things, even if they kind of look samey in terms of, they're all kind of armored squat creatures.
I don't think I want to know how they know how an armored dinosaur might decay and or be good at bloating and
Yeah,
floating.
the work's been done. You can look up those papers.
Yeah. Well, we have some great questions.
All right.
I'm gonna ask Little Kinder Club their question. I'm gonna ask that first, although I might need y'all to elaborate a little bit on your question. So their question is, what about invertebrates? And I think they were asking that when you're talking about what Stegosaurus likes to eat. But they may have been talking about like what invertebrates maybe looked like at this time, like in the ecosystem.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll let you know if they give a clarifying.
If it's the former, that is part of the argument that some ankylosaurs may have been omnivores, so they could have been eating things like worms and bugs in addition to plants. It's unlikely that it would have been able to eat enough of those to, even at its relatively small size, to support its bulk. One thing we know very little about in the Mesozoic era is animal interactions, vertebrate interactions specifically, with colonial insects. So nowadays, it is a lot of the armored creatures are specialists on ants and termites. So you think like the pangolin, armadillos, these are heavily armored creatures that are invertebrate specialists. And in some cases, will feed on one type of insect particularly. And there has been some argument that there were dinosaurs, actually one that we talked about, I think, on an earlier old news, these Alvarez-saurs that have the very short claw-like forelimbs that they may have been used for ripping open, if not termite nests, if termite nests didn't exist at the time, at least like the rotting logs where early termites and early sort of colonial hymenopterans, things of the ant lineage, let's say, would have been living. So it hasn't really been proposed, to my knowledge, for ankylosaurs, in part because they don't have like claws that would be particularly great at tearing open nests. Like they have kind of basic hoof-like structures. Of course, hey, who's to say they couldn't, knock one over with their tail club or their Mazahuit in order to get at things inside. So certainly possible, but it's very, without gut contents preserved, it's very difficult to be sure. In terms of the invertebrates that were coexisting in these deposits of the Dorotea Formation in Lake Cretaceous, to my knowledge, we have no record. So generally, the deposits that preserve vertebrates do not preserve invertebrates well. So we don't know what was coexisting in these ecosystems. There are, in the earlier Cretaceous in Brazil, there are really insect-rich deposits that show a huge diversity comparable to what is seen today. Most of the major insect groups, at least, are already there. But it's unclear whether that is sort of specific to that area or whether these groups were all like globally distributed at the time.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you. And Little Kinder Club now has bingo.
Oh,
So,
wonderful. Congratulations.
yeah, that was perfect. So Anne has a great question. Do you think that better paleontology will come out of the Southern Hemisphere now, as opposed to the gold rush like fossil hunting that was in North America?
Oh, yeah, in the sense that these are, these deposits that are being worked for the first time. We can use basically the modern methodologies of paleontology rather than dynamiting a hillside and bringing it on ox cart to,
Right.
Andrew
And
Carnegie's
competing.
laboratory or wherever.
Yeah.
Yes.
And competing too, right? Weren't they often competing to like name the most critters?
Well, I mean, there's still that to an extent today,
Okay.
but definitely less to a lesser degree, and certainly with less like actionable skullduggery as happened in the Bone Wars between like Cope and Marsh, for instance. I think the difference though, which is like, so in general, my answer is yes. Like the people who are doing the work are very good scientists using all the modern techniques. The downside of that is that a lot of these departments and research groups are very underfunded. So compared to like the Gilded Age opulence of robber barons writing a blank check for someone to go out to Wyoming and pull back whatever they want, people are dealing with very limited budgets around the world, but like especially in some of these South American countries where there's the science budget is reduced every year, museums are burning down. It's a bad situation. So really, need additional public support for in these countries for that, and internationally, like any funding schemes that can help support that. So yeah, I mean, if they can get the money to do the work, they're certainly qualified to do amazing research.
Mhm. All right. Well, so we've got a few more minutes. So
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, what kind of challenges did the team have when they were discovering this species? Like in discovering it and excavating it, maybe getting it back to their, you know, museum or school or research lab, wherever they
Mm-hmm.
were going to study it.
I don't know all the details of its discovery. I know that it is a very difficult region to work just because it's far from, the heavily inhabited parts of Chile, very far from the capital, where a lot of these researchers are based. Limited local infrastructure to get to the site. These are harsh terrains. It can be brutally cold a lot of the year, or very hot if you're on clear skies in the austral summer. And it is. My understanding is the rock that it was in was very, very hard, and it was a pretty brutal excavation. But that's true of a lot of paleontology. It is, we don't all get to, I'm very, very lucky, even though the animals I work on are in hard rock, that, I can just drive like 20 miles to find fossils here in the Research Triangle area. This is multi-day just to get out there in Ultima Esperanza, where they found Stegoros. And, that's true of a lot of places. For Antarctica, Antarctic expeditions is worse than this even. So there are hurdles to some of these sites to just being able to work them in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, I just think it's so interesting how the paleontology research process works. And now that I've had that very brief, like 1 day of paleontology fieldwork experience, I just have a better appreciation for how much work goes into it. And so
Yeah.
when they're, excavating things from the top of a mountain, in a very cold area, I feel for them. But
Yeah.
it's so exciting to have this come out of it, like this awesome little Stegoros.
Yeah. Also, you have to, keep in mind it's with paleontology, these are all multi-year processes. So the fossil was first found by a different group of scientists who were looking at other stuff in this area and noted that a fossil was at the surface. And then they let scientists in Santiago know about it. And then they were able to mount a secondary expedition to get out there and actually collect the specimen. But this is all happening over long time spans of learning about it, well, discovering it, learning about what's actually there, actually getting it and digging it out, actually preparing it, studying it. So it can take a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I can only imagine.
There are specimens that, there are specimens that have been pulled out of the field and then are in the basement of a museum for 100 years in some cases. But, I know of specimens that have been excavated and have been worked on basically constantly since excavation. And it took 30 years to actually publish the paper on it.
Wow.
And that's an extreme case. It's a large animal in very hard rock. But, such things are not unknown in paleo.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this was not a 30-year venture.
No, this is
nowhere near
substantially less than 30 years.
Good. Well, that is all the time we have today for old news, but thank you all for joining us and sharing some awesome questions. Christian, thank you for sharing your expertise. And
my pleasure as always.
This was a really cool discovery. It's always cool to hear of a new dinosaur, especially a cute one. That's a hill I will die on, is that Stegoros is really cute.
Agreed.
Yeah. So everyone mark your calendars for January 11th, 2022. We will join you in the new year with another new discovery. And if you would like to register and receive reminder emails and get supplemental materials like this awesome coloring page / anatomy diagram, which is drawn by our coworker Alexander Luke. You can register for Old News, so we put a link in the video description down there at the bottom. And yeah, we hope that you join us again in January and beyond, and have a happy holiday season, everyone.
Yeah, happy holidays, everybody. And yeah, can't wait to see what new discoveries 2022 will bring.
It's crazy that it's already 2022.
Well, it's not right now, but
well, it's basically 2022.
Yeah.
Okay, it's happening.
Just give me these last few weeks.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye. Stay safe out there, everybody.